All right, let's get started. So good morning, everyone, and to our friends and colleagues based in Asia or in Europe, good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to the Central Asia Program seminars. My name is Sébastien Pérouse. I'm a research professor working with the Central Asia Program at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. So today, we're going to address the situation in Karakalpakstan. We've heard a lot 2 months ago, in the beginning of July, about the protests that erupted in this region after President Mirziyoyev proposed amendments to the constitutions that would have deprived the region from its subnational autonomy. And the protest led to serious violence, casualties, the number of killed people, injured, and arrested is still being discussed. But in addition to the debates on the figures of people impacted by the violence of these events, there are many serious questions about the political, economic, and social impact of these events. And this includes, for example, the decision to implement stifling restrictions on the activities of non-governmental organizations. So to address this topic and the many topics related to Karakalpakstan today, we wanted to combine different voices, both from Karakalpakstan and from the outside, but all independent voices. And we have for that 3 excellent speakers today with Balsanam Karakalpakova, Bruce Pannier, and Steve Love. So the 3 of them are going to make a short presentation, about 10 minutes, and after their presentations we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free to send your question in the chat box. So Balsanam, Bruce, and Steve, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your findings and on such an important and sensitive topic. We reversed a little bit the order of speakers, and actually, so we're gonna start with Bruce Pannier. So Bruce is a Central Asia analyst. He has served as a long-time journalist and correspondent covering Central Asia at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Prior to joining RFERL in 1997, Bruce worked at the Open Media Research Institute in Prague. In 1992, he led a sociological project in Central Asia sponsored by the University of Manchester and the Soros Cultural Initiative Foundation. And during that time, he lived in villages in Central Asia, especially in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Bruce studied at Tashkent State University in the summer of 1990 and at Columbia University. He has written many papers, reports for journals and organizations. And I would add that since many years, Bruce has been really an outstanding contributor to bringing and circulating knowledge on many of the most sensitive and important topics that Central Asian countries are facing. So, Bruce, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you to George Washington University Central Asia Program, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and it's always good to see you, Sebastian. So great to participate in this. And thanks to everyone who's attending the event. I'm going to give some background on Karakalpakstan and something a little bit about Uzbekistan in general. And I hope what I will say will help to give those who aren't extremely well versed in Karakalpakstan some details and better understand the situation there. The Karakalpakstan, the sovereign republic, accounts for roughly 38% of territory of Uzbekistan. There are, according to figures released by the Uzbek government in August 2021, there are a little bit more than 750,000 ethnic Karakalpaks in Uzbekistan. Obviously, not all of them live in the Karakalpakstan Republic, but there's 750,000 out in Uzbekistan. It is the poorest region in Uzbekistan. It's mainly desert. Over the years, there have been allegations of discrimination against the Karakalpaks, although I know that other people have told me when I've had this conversation that there's generally been discrimination against many groups, including Uzbeks in Uzbekistan too. But among some of the allegations of discrimination against Karakalpaks from the last 20 years, I've heard tales of forced sterilization of young women. And again, to be fair, these accusations are made and include women who are non-Karakalpak also, but I've heard it most about Karakalpakstan. The ecological conditions in the region have been deteriorating for decades. Uzbekistan's section of what was the Aral Sea is in Karakalpakstan, and within just the last few decades, it's dried up to being almost nothing. So the people in the region, this is well within living memory. Anyone living in Karakalpakstan anytime in the last 30 years will have seen the conditions get worse out there in their region. But at the same time, this region is rich in oil and natural gas. There's, by some estimates, conservative estimates, there's 1.7 trillion cubic meters of natural gas in Karakalpakstan, and there could be 2 or 3 times that much. Now, to put that in some perspective, the European Union prior to this year was importing 150 to 160 billion cubic meters of gas from Russia, right? So the amount of gas they have in Karakalpakstan is huge. And that's where we find most of the big recent gas fields and where the biggest exploration is going on in the country. At the same time, all this money, in some ways, it's parallel to what we see in Western Kazakhstan. This is where all the money is being made. This is where all the country is getting a huge share of its revenue. And yet hasn't been much of a trickle-down effect in Karakalpakstan. Like I said, it remains the poorest country in the region, in the country. So I'll give current President Shavkat Mirziyoyev some credit for paying more attention to Karakalpakstan than his predecessor Islam Karimov did, certainly. But at the same time, again, you're starting from a very low base here, and since so much of the money, so much of the revenue for Uzbekistan has been coming out of this region, and more recently, Uzbekistan has had its own gas problems, right? So it's in a vital region for Uzbekistan in that sense that the country has gone from being a gas exporter to becoming a gas importer. So Karakalpakstan is the key to a lot of problems in Uzbekistan. It is an important region for the whole country and all the people in it. Now, for almost 100 years now, Karakalpakstan has been a unique entity, no matter what country it was part of, right? It was actually an autonomous region within the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic at the very start in 1924. It became a part of the Kazakh autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic after that. It briefly was its own autonomous Soviet Republic before being joined to Uzbekistan. And then we know after, in 1990, it adopted its first constitution, which gave it the right to secede. And of course, that's a big part of our discussion today. That was where the origins of its right to secede came. In 1990, it adopted a new constitution in 1993, which had the same kind of benefit, on paper anyway, benefits for the region. It was supposed to be still a sovereign region. It was supposed to hold a referendum in 20 years, although the Constitution gives it the right to hold a referendum on secession anytime it wants, but it was supposed to hold one 20 years after the passing of the Constitution, which did not happen. That should have been in 2013. There were a few people who mentioned that in the years leading up to 2013, but they were run out of the country by the authorities or for fear of being locked up. So, but it has maintained, although it's poor, it has always maintained this interesting status, right? I suppose it's something that the people can identify with, that they have their own specific territory out there. I mentioned there was 750,000 Karakalpaks. There's, again, I don't know how many of those actually, most of them probably live in Karakalpakstan. I couldn't say exactly how many, but the total population of the Karakalpak Republic is 2 million. So they do not make up the majority, even in Karakalpakstan, which kind of shows that if they did have a vote on secession, you have to wonder how it would go. That said, I will mention that there has really never been any, until July 1st, there was never any unrest or violence out in Karakalpakstan that I can ever remember. There wasn't any huge protests or anything that prompted some kind of government crackdown, which is why July 1st was such a strange event because we'd never seen anything like this happen before. Those are pretty much the facts about Karakalpakstan. And what I'm going to say now is more of how I've been watching, what I've seen from watching what's been happening in Karakalpakstan. And we know on July 1st, there was a big protest. We know they detained the protest, who at least authorities say was the protest leader, and there seems to be some merit to that, Davlet Murad Tajimuratov. The protest was still peaceful. He was supposedly outside the administration building with one of the heads of the administration, and the crowd was calmed down. It was really when the security forces and police moved in and tried to disperse the crowd that the violence broke out. So there's a lot of questions about what was the spark that started all this violence. Now there's a lot of questions about what the investigation is finding out. And of course, we don't know everything about it. The Uzbek government, as you know, formed an independent commission. Most of the members are members of the government. It's true, although they do have, Steve had mentioned that Azam Farmonov, who's a human rights activist, is part of that. But trying to look at this from the point of view of the Karakalpaks, who seem to be the majority of the people who are detained in this. While there are some Karakalpaks on the panel, there are people who are associated or believed to be closely associated with the government. So there's a lot of questions about how independent the independent commission is. I will give them credit to some members of the commission anyway, who are on Twitter all the time and are talking about what the progress in this investigation. However, we don't get very many facts. We have their side of it. I also am watching on Twitter for people who are members of Karakalpak rights groups, activist groups, too, and what they say in response to these tweets that come from government officials. So they are looking into it, but there's a lot of blank spots here. I hope that the officials say that they're independent and impartial in investigating this, and I hope that's true. But there's a lot of facts that they aren't willing to reveal so far to the public. Among them, they say that NGOs are involved, but to date, I have not heard any of the names of any of the NGOs that are actually involved in this. We are told that the people that are detained, and there was more than 500 people detained in the wake of this, right? That we know of, that the government says, that the people are not being mistreated, and that they have access to lawyers. But we don't know this from the people or the relatives themselves. This is what we're told. It's constantly one of the facets of this investigation is some parts of it are held to be secret, or they can't release the information now. But unfortunately, it leads to a lot of questions about how this investigation is actually proceeding at the moment. We have photos of people that they are talking to, and sometimes it's only the back of the head of the people. And in fact, Tajimuratov, they had just put up photos of him being questioned by a member, talking to people of members of the commission, but it was only from the back of his head, so we don't know. We are assured that he is in good health, that he has no complaints about his prison conditions, that he's not suffering any ill treatment, and that he does have access to attorneys at the moment, but we don't hear him saying that himself. Now, the last thing I want to say here is although, again, I hope that the members of the commission are acting in good faith and living up to all the promises that they're making on there, but the general impression of the Uzbek authorities, if you're in a room with a bunch of people from, even if it's an independent commission, these are government officials, the history of Uzbekistan would suggest that you're in a lot of problem. You have a big problem here. You're in a lot of trouble because, generally speaking, once you are detained, you are presumed to be guilty. That's the history of the country. Now, I know they're trying to change that, but that is the history of Uzbekistan. If you're called in and put in a room and you're being questioned, the chances are, for everyone in the country, you're going to think you're on the edge of going to prison, right? And you're not, for the relatives or other people who are being brought in as witnesses, who have to live there. They have no hope of getting out of this country. So they have to live in Karakalpakstan and in Uzbekistan for the rest of their lives. So you have to be very, very careful about what you're going to respond, what your response is going to be to these kind of questions, because you have to wonder if there might not be retaliation somewhere down the road. People are paying attention now. So things seem to be proceeding civilly at the moment. But if you're 20, 30 years old and looking at living there the rest of your life, and you're being questioned by members of this commission, who some of whom you know are members of the government, you're probably not going to be entirely candid about the situation. And I think that's a real shame, because they do have a golden opportunity to lend more credibility to this by allowing some independent people to participate in this. And certainly one would be Steve Spurlow, who you're going to hear from at the end of this presentation. But I know, for instance, there's a highly respected journalist who's in the Nakuz today and could be included in some of these sessions too, questioning both the detained and witnesses and relatives of the detained, to add a little bit more credibility to this. Because again, as I said, generally, and I myself have been picked up by various law enforcement agencies in Uzbekistan, and it's an intimidating few hours to sit in the room with a bunch of people who are have very unsympathetic looks. A lot of times, I'm not saying the members of the commission are like that, have this stern look, but still, most people in the back of their mind are going to wonder if anything that they say that contradicts the authorities' narrative will not end up landing them in a lot of trouble further down the road. So I think I'll just leave it there and leave time for the other guests and maybe some questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for this very open presentation. Our next speaker is Balsanam Karakalpakova, who is Balsanam is an international development professional. She traveled a lot throughout Central Asia, and Balsanam is an activist for justice and fair treatment of the Karakalpak people. So Balsanam, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. After the collapse of the USSR in 1993, Karakalpakstan signed a 20-year reunification agreement with Uzbekistan, which guaranteed the republic's constitutional right to withdraw via referendum from Uzbekistan. According to the agreement, after 20 years, the parties would either extend the agreement or Karakalpakstan would hold a referendum on leaving Uzbekistan. The agreement has expired, but unfortunately, Uzbekistan's control over Karakalpakstan has not. Karakalpak people cannot elect their own head of the government. The leader of Karakalpakstan is appointed by Uzbek government, by Uzbek president to be specific, an arrangement that was meant to protect the right and the legitimate identity of Karakalpak people is in terror and oppression. In June of this year, the Uzbek government announced two constitutional amendments. First is to strip the sovereignty of Karakalpakstan, and second, to extend the presidential term from 5 to 7 years, letting the current president to be in power for additional 14 years. Karakalpak people were outraged by this. For weeks, Karakalpaks objected to the Uzbek government's proposal, but the Uzbek government didn't care to give them a response. Then Daulat Murad Tajimuratov, a journalist with a background in law, decided to organize a peaceful protest. In Uzbekistan, in order to conduct a protest, it is necessary to get permission from the government. Daulat Murad followed the law. He applied for permission to host a peaceful protest. On the same day he did that, the security came to his house. They trashed his house. They beat Daulat Murad severely. And they took him to prison. They took him in prison.
Balsanam, do you want to take a short break, have Steve speak and come back? What would you be more comfortable with?
For violating international law. When people heard of it, they went on the streets. People from rural areas came on foot as the roads to Nukus, capital of Karakalpakstan, were closed. Thousands of people went to the protests demanding the release of Daulat Murad. The protesters were all peaceful. They didn't have any weapons. The Uzbek government precisely murdered these peaceful protesters anyway. They shot people with rifles and grenade launchers. Peaceful people protesting a constitutional amendment. Now the police are making arrests and interrogating people every day. The snipers targeted male genitals, consistent with the long history of Uzbek government suppressing the Karakalpak ethnicity and sterilizing women. I spoke to several hospital workers. They said that all of the hospitals in Nukus were packed with injured people, and the most common injury was a gunshot to genitals. BBC covered the tragic events that happened in Karakalpakstan. Some British diplomats wrote articles. The mainstream media is silent, particularly in the US. We tried to approach the Washington Post, New York Times, MSNBC, CNN, NBC. They turned a blind eye. Meanwhile, Putin praised the Uzbek president and gave him an award recognizing him as a fighter against the West. The Uzbek president is a straight-A student of Putin. He murders innocent people, and just like Putin, he is planning to make a constitutional amendment to be extended his duration of his leadership and become a dictator. Living in the West, I cherish our values of democracy and freedom. There is perhaps nothing more offensive to freedom than murdering peaceful protesters and using the Constitution for the benefit of despots rather than the people. America is a leader of free world, so I beg America, be a leader. We need your leadership. Please help the voice of Karakalpak people to be heard. Also, I think it's better to see once than to hear a lot. And I want to share with you 30 seconds video that will give you a glimpse of what happened in Karakalpakstan. So you could see what happened, just to get a glimpse what happened. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Balzadem. I mean, for your report and for your courage to report all these very sad events, especially from your point of view. I understand that this is extremely moving for you. So thank you very, very much for being with us today. Our next speaker will be Steve Siadlov. So Steve is a human rights lawyer and associate professor of the practice of human rights in the Department of Political and International Relations at the University of Southern California. Steve received his JD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and his MA in International Affairs from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs with a certificate in post-Soviet studies from the Harriman Institute. So Steve is a very well-known expert on the former Soviet region. He teaches international human rights law, human rights research and advocacy, and he also teaches on human rights in Eurasia. And last year and this year, working with Peace Nexus Foundation, Steve assisted Uzbek human rights defender, Uzbekistan-based cotton manufacturers, and Uzbek authorities in the implementation of a methodology to help ensure that Uzbekistan is adhering to the ban on forced and child labor in cotton harvesting. In October 2021, Steve authored a major report for Congress on religious freedom in Uzbekistan, and he was also a senior Central Asia researcher at Human Rights Watch from 2010 to 2019, and he founded its Kyrgyzstan field office. So thank you so much, Steve, for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Sebastian, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me okay, and it's an honor to be with Bruce, of course, and I think it takes a lot of courage, Paulson, to do what you're doing. So thank you for making this presentation one of the few that has included a Karakalpak perspective, which I think has been sorely lacking and really needed. So thank you again to George Washington University for providing that platform. For those of you that have seen me at some of these talks, I tend to often stick on the human rights news, but in this presentation, I thought I'd be a little bit different, and building on what Bruce and Paulson have done, try to provide a little bit more of a historical context to actually on this issue of ethnic minorities in Uzbekistan, because to understand Karakalpakstan's crisis, I think we need to look at the government's approach over time. And also, I would argue, and probably my main recommendation beyond some of the more immediate ones regarding the investigation, is to look at the guidance that international human rights law has for Uzbekistan on the protection of ethnic minorities. And it was news to me and very useful to learn that just 2 years ago, in fact, 2 years before the crisis broke out in Karakalpakstan, you had the UN leading body on ethnic discrimination, that's the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, actually citing Uzbekistan over its continuing failure or gap in collecting statistics. Now, that's not the most dramatic recommendation, but very important, on the failure to collect accurate statistics on its ethnic breakdown, on demographics that are important for forming policy. And why is this relevant beyond this crisis in Karakalpakstan? Well, it's relevant because we haven't had a census in Uzbekistan since 1989. And guess what? Uzbekistan plans to conduct one in 2023. So this is all, I think, very important for responding to very real claims of ethnic discrimination that are involved here in the crisis in Karakalpakstan, but also more broadly to looking at Uzbekistan as a multi-ethnic state. Now, I would say that for many people, it was July 1st, July 2nd, when many even had heard of the Karakalpaks. Lots of journalists were reaching out and asking about this group. And so many had not considered how multi-ethnic Uzbekistan actually is. And I think that one thing that this crisis shows us is that contrary to what some would say, ethnic minority issues in Uzbekistan have actually many times become flashpoints, especially when they intersect with socioeconomic and political issues. So I think it bears looking at how the Uzbek authorities have dealt with ethnic minority issues, as I said previously. And so what I did in a recent piece, and thank you for the diplomat and Katie Putz, who's on the line, for supporting this research, was to look at what I would call a sort of out of sight, out of mind approach that Tashkent has traditionally taken to its ethnic minorities. And I didn't look at all ethnic minorities, and I certainly didn't look at the Russian case, which is very deserves a separate treatment, and Sebastian is an expert actually on that question, has written on it. What I did was look at three major areas of ethnic minority policy. Of course, the Karakalpaks and updating the human rights situation. I'll try to get to that at the end. But the first two groups I looked at were the Meshetian Turks, which some of you may have or may have not heard of, a group deported by Stalin in 1944 to Uzbekistan and then forced to flee in pogroms in 1989 to other parts of post-Soviet space, and also the Tajiks, which are most likely, I think there's little debate now, maybe Bruce can help me with this, but the second largest ethnic group in Uzbekistan after the large outmigration of Russians in the early 90s. So certainly looking at the treatment of all three and the relationship to Uzbekistan helps give us some lessons for the census and for this current crisis. So I would say that we have, of course, like many things in Uzbekistan, we have Islam Karimov to thank for the approach to ethnic minorities, which I call out of sight, out of mind. It was very much inheriting the Soviet legacy of emphasizing the friendship of peoples, but at the same time really stamping out any real avenues for cultural expression and political representation. And again, I think if you looked at these unprecedented protests in July 1st and July 2nd, which are maybe the largest in Uzbekistan's modern history, we can see that beyond the political, beyond the economic issues, beyond the haphazard attempt to introduce these constitutional amendments which angered people, there is also the real question of the lack of political representation for ethnic minorities. So Karimov's approach was to erode that voice. In the early 90s, what he did very systematically was eliminate any NGOs representing, for example, the Tajik minority. And this issue became, in the first case of the Meshetian Turks, I argue is very important for us to consider. Now, why is this important? The Meshetian Turks that lived in the Fergana Valley mostly, but also in Tashkent, were subjected to pogroms in 1989, still very murky circumstances. The Meshetian Turk community talks about the involvement of Uzbek nationalists that set upon the community and dozens were killed. Of course, others and largely the Uzbek community pointed blame towards Moscow and the Soviet authorities for orchestrating these events. We don't really know the full story, but what I would argue here, and you can read the piece for more detail, is that what's significant, what's interesting, is how little we ever hear in Uzbekistan about the 1989 events, about the Meshetian Turks, of which 100,000 people, or 90,000 people, I should say, fled Uzbekistan. For 30 years now, almost no discussion, not in the press, not by the government. Of course, that shouldn't surprise us too much with an authoritarian situation. But what it does show is I think it laid the groundwork for how ethnic minorities would not be discussed, not examined going forward. And that's very significant. The next group I looked at, of course, the ethnic Tajiks, much, much larger. Well, there may be 5,000 to 10,000 Meshetian Turks still in Uzbekistan. Tajiks could be around certainly way beyond the 1.5 million that were discussed in the 1989 census. And again, significant for Karakalpakstan is this lack of statistics. It's not something we often talk about as a dramatic issue in human rights recommendations, but the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination repeatedly cited Uzbekistan's failure, as I mentioned, in its 2020 concluding observations, where it actually discusses Karakalpakstan and language rights. It says, we urge Uzbekistan to provide up-to-date statistics on the composition of its population, disaggregated by ethnicity, national origin, and languages spoken, including data on migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons. Later in those recommendations, it talks about the lack of information about prison populations and knowing how many Tajiks, how many Karakalpaks, how many other ethnic minorities are in Uzbekistan. Now, we know that the way that the borders between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan were divided in the 30s created this jigsaw where the minority Tajik community, many of them had felt that historical centers of Tajik culture had been left in Uzbekistan. And as I said, in the early 90s, these conversations started to emerge. Tajik NGOs in Samarkand and Bukhara, largely talking about cultural autonomy, not about separatism, were immediately, the leaders of those organizations immediately arrested. And that history is not often discussed. It's not often considered. And in 2009, in fact, the UN Human Rights Committee looked at a case called Mavlonov and Sadi versus Uzbekistan. This was a case that dealt with the inability of ethnic Tajiks in Uzbekistan to study in their own language, to receive an education. And the committee said that the use of minority languages is an essential element of Tajik minority culture. It ruled that Uzbekistan was actually in violation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on the language issue. So this has come up before, and I think it's really important that Uzbek authorities think about these core obligations beyond this investigation, beyond getting to the legality of the use of force, thinking about language rights, political representation. Now on to the Karakalpaks in the time that I have left. Let me say that I think that Bruce really laid out many of the issues well, and so did Paul Sanem. But let me update some of the findings. I've been paying close attention to the fact that the findings of the Parliamentary Commission, or I should say the official sources that we've heard so far about 21 deaths, are highly divergent from the reports we're getting from human rights groups like the Open Dialogue Foundation, and also the noted and respected longtime observer of Karakalpak politics and issues, Vitaly Ponomaryov of the Memorial Human Rights Center. Their reports point to at a minimum 46 deaths. So that's 2.5 times larger than the official sources. And I would argue that while the Parliamentary Commission is important, and of course we want it to do its work, and I'm eager to hear those findings, it won't be considered credible. And there have already been serious concerns raised about its independence. It won't be considered credible unless the Uzbek government invite international and independent voices to Uzbekistan to interrogate those findings. And we haven't, so far we've seen the commission resist, while it has been all over Telegram and all over social media. What they have resisted, to my knowledge so far, are real-time press conferences where there's an opportunity to ask questions that are difficult in real time. And I think they should do that, given that they've been so public on social media. The other development that I think Sebastian and Bruce touched on, the new law on NGOs, which is so incredibly restrictive. And the Uzbek German Forum did a great piece about this recently, which requires NGOs, in order to get funding, to partner with the government in anything they do, will stifle independent activism in Uzbekistan to another level, which I think should concern all of us. And it makes it virtually impossible for ethnic minority communities to really organize themselves in civil society and address some of these issues that are at the core of these protests, which again are language rights, political representation. I would say, interestingly, also on the composition of the commission, there's been some skepticism about some of the members on the commission. For example, the populist member of parliament, Alisher Kadyrov, who's very colorful in his statements, but who has made many statements at the time that are quite off-putting to ethnic minorities. One of the observers that I respect in summing up her skepticism, the noted activist Farida Sharifulina, she said, "What is Alisher Kadyrov doing on this commission? Already chosen to serve, he declared clearly that the Uzbek people are against the word sovereign or sovereignty for Karakalpakstan, and explicitly called for it to be denied, even its illusory sovereignty." Kadyrov is, of course, a star in the vein of Zhirinovsky, for those of us that follow Russian nationalist politics. So I think these are important concerns. And I would just end by saying that international human rights law, and specifically the Convention on Ethnic Discrimination, it says a lot about the recommendations that Uzbekistan should be taking into account as it moves towards the 2023 census. Let's start talking about ethnic minorities in Uzbekistan. Let's have the government invite human rights groups and independent observers and Karakalpak voices more into this discussion. I hope to see that. And only that way, I think, can we really get to the bottom of these events. Thank you so much, Sebastian. Sorry for going on.
No, it's okay. Thank you so much, Steve. I mean, your 3 presentations open, of course, many questions. Let me maybe follow up with a question on the ethnic minorities that you were addressing, Steve. I mean, so as you explained, it's very difficult to get some reliable information on the ethnic composition in Karakalpakstan. But do you have any information on how do ethnic minorities in the region see the violent events that occurred in July? I mean, did they participate, or do you consider that mostly ethnic Karakalpaks were engaged in these events? So in other words, do we have any idea of the ethnic composition of these demonstrations which happened in July?
Paul, do you want to start?
I mean, yeah, the question is for the three of you, of course.
Well, I would just throw in that since we don't know all the names of the people, all the people that have been detained, most of the people that have been detained, it's very difficult to, that would be the first indication we would have of who was detained. I would imagine that the majority of the people that are detained are ethnic Karakalpaks. But like I said, we have no data to say. All we have is you know, both sides of the argument. But I would imagine that that's true. But again, we just don't have any names. They're not releasing names of people. They say in the interest of the investigation.
Yeah, I want to respond about the people who are detained right now. So Davlet Murat Tajimuratov, he is the leader who wanted to have a peaceful protest. Then Lala Gul, she's a journalist. And Azamat Turdanov, he is a world famous athlete. And those three major people, and then we have thousands more that are arrested and they're being tortured in prison. The list is big to mention. And also, you know, I want to state the fact that the genocide of Karakalpak people has been going on for years, and some of the people here might have heard about the prison Jaslik. It is like gulag, type of gulag in Central Asia. It's one of the worst prisons. Inhumane treatment of prisoners. It was built in Karakalpakstan, and it was for Karakalpak people. Thousands of people, Karakalpak, were killed in that prison. So right now, I agree with Steve that we need international community to be intervened and to do independent investigation of this tragic events that took place. And also I want to mention that US sanctioned Uzbekistan for using child labor to pick the cotton. But when Uzbek government murdered so many people, innocent people, US government is not putting on any sanctions. We would like to request that the Western world and US will put sanctions, will demand on Uzbekistan to have transparent investigation.
Maybe just to add, I mean, I'd say, well, Paul Sanem, I think these are really important concerns. I think we have to recognize Jaslik was closed, which was a great step forward, although there are some reports about remaining prisoners that may have still been kept there. Although by and large, I think, again, that was a result of the international community being appropriately tough on Uzbekistan regarding the Jaslik prison in Karakalpakstan. And notably, Azam Farmonov, who sits on the parliamentary commission, served for 9 years and was tortured. He's ethnic Uzbek, by the way, in Jaslik. And it's good to have him on the commission. It's important to have him on the commission. It's also important to have some of the other members that Bruce mentioned, Gulnoz Mamarasulova, and they've been reaching out, they've been available to speak, although I would like to see more of a real two-way conversation. and again, a larger conversation that takes into account international human rights law's recommendations. And as I said, Sebastian, to your initial question, the key issue we have here is across all spheres of Uzbekistan society, education, the prison system, healthcare, so many issues. We do not have the data on ethnic minority representation or on demographics. And that is a gap that has existed. I mean, we are still, as scholars, looking back to the 1989 census. I know you've probably suffered with that lack of data in your own work. And it's just shocking. It's amazing. And the census was put off, I think, 2 years. Also, of course, COVID had something to do with that. But 2023 is a chance for there to be some steps forward on this. And I should also just say, I think that in terms of this commission, obviously the government has learned some important lessons after the Andijan massacre. It was important that President went to Karakalpakstan, walked back those amendments immediately, but it's not enough. And again, as Bruce said, all these forces line up against these individuals. I've been very troubled to see the video of people like Taji Muratov, only seeing him from the back, getting these statements. It's sort of one-sided social media engagement that in some ways could violate his own due process rights as a defendant. It's somewhat troubling, and I think there has to be a much stronger commitment on the part of the Uzbek authorities to adhere to the principles of due process of international human rights law in conducting this investigation.
Thank you. Let me take, I received one more question about the reactions of the international community. And the question is, what is known about the actions of the United Nations representative of national minorities to protect the rights of the Karakalpaks? What sanctions does the UN plan to apply for the execution and torture in Karakalpakstan against the authorities of Uzbekistan?
Bruce, were you gonna? Well, I would say I would say this. We know that for years, one important development, there are very few on the protection of ethnic minorities, has been that the OSCE has been one of those entities where the High Commissioner on National Minorities has, over the years, periodically been one of the few players to visit the Central Asian countries and raise these issues, usually confidentially, with the president. With the presidents of the Central Asian countries. So those issues have been raised, I think, very sporadically, very periodically, not enough. And again, the UN Human Rights, not the Human Rights Committee, but the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination said in these very recent statements in 2020, they said this, they said that the absence of complaints about ethnic discrimination, which we often hear, right? We often hear from Uzbek officials, there's no complaints. Everything's good, friendship of peoples, we're multi-ethnic. But they say the absence of complaints about ethnic discrimination does not mean that minority rights are adequately protected. And I think these protests, they could not have been so large. They could not have been so unprecedentedly huge were it not for some deep-seated concerns, both about health, and Bruce mentioned, this earlier history, certainly more during Karimov, of concerns about forced sterilization, which affected not only Karakalpaks, but Uzbeks. But those things were driving people in addition to these core issues of identity.
Thank you. I received a specific question here about the Karakalpak journalist Lola Gul Kalikhanova, who runs the independent Makan.uz news website, who disappeared in early July after covering events. Is there any recent information about her? Do you have any information?
I'll let you start.
No, there is no information. The government is silent. They are keeping it undercover. The only person that they showed from the back, it was Dawlet Murad, and we don't even know if it was Dawlet Murad or somebody else.
Okay.
So no information. The government is not doing its job. And also, I want to clarify that the Uzbek government is the biggest criminal. They are the one who is violating the rules and the law, because people had their legal right to protest. But Uzbek government is murdered those people, but also they are arresting people daily. Thousands of people. I keep hearing on a daily basis how many people are arrested and about poor treatment in prison. So uh, we should take Uzbekistan to International Court of Justice.
Thank you. Go ahead. Yes, please. Yeah.
Just on Laligul, I would say that, according to, and Bruce, probably you saw this as well, Gazeta Uz did a report just on the 6th of September where they did report on this meeting with Daulat Murat, Taji Murat, but they also at least mentioned in the piece that Laligul was also one of the people that has been part of the investigation. It's unclear whether or not the charges of Article 159, which is attempts to overthrow the constitutional order of Uzbekistan, have been applied to her. And I do wonder whether there will be a slightly different approach, in that often in these cases, we see women as defendants treated a little bit differently. And I wonder what will happen here. But we do know that what's very concerning to me is to see Article 159 brought out. Now, we have, as I said, there are differences in the way the government responded after Andijan and the way the government responds now. But one consistently troubling moment is the presence of anti-terrorism, anti-extremism charges that have so often been associated with political repression. That's Article 159 for unconstitutional activity. That really, I think, should be looked at closely.
Thank you, Steve. So the government of Uzbekistan seems to be worried about the potential independence of Karakalpakstan. The question is, are there really independentist movements? I mean, are they active? Do they really have an influence? What about, for example, the movement Alga Karakalpakstan? So generally, are there movements that really want to secede?
Well, I'll start. What the heck? I mean, there certainly is a segment of the population that would like to see that. The amazing thing about these amendments to the Constitution that I keep coming back to is I don't understand why members of the commission that were, the Constitutional Commission that were working on the amendments decided to even bring this up. There was a status quo that was working in Karakalpakstan. I know some people, and Steve and I have met with some of them in the past too, that did want to secede and did want independence from Karakalpakstan. I don't think that the majority of the people in Karakalpakstan, even if they want it, believe that it's possible. This right to secede, the right to sovereignty and everything are on paper. But in fact, we know Uzbekistan, for instance, has the constitutional right to defend the territory of Karakalpakstan. You can interpret very many ways. So there was really no problem until they decided to do these constitutional amendments. And like I said, I keep coming back to why did they even bring this up when it wasn't such an issue? Again, I don't speak for the Karakalpak people. Certainly don't speak for every one of them. Maybe there are a lot of people who think they would be better off. Like I said, they have huge gas reserves, but it's a blessing and a curse. For that very reason, they're unlikely to get independence from Uzbekistan. And in the end of the day, no country I can think of will want to give up 38% of its territory, right? You might want that to happen, but as far as the government's concerned, I don't think it will. And I think a lot of people realize that was reality. But what they did want in Karakalpakstan is at least some equality. I mean, this is years of discrimination and neglect being piled on top of each other. And then for all of a sudden, here's one thing that distinguishes that region. And they're going to pull that away from them too. You can kind of understand the frustration and the anger at this. If you don't pay any attention to this, you're making all the money off our region. We don't see any of it. And now, now you're going to take away our nominal sovereignty at the same time. It doesn't make sense. And can I add one comment just on the investigation, if I could, real quick too, that I probably should have said when I was in my speech. The investigation. One of the other troubling things about the investigation to me is that we see the people who are detained who are from the protesters, right? But as Paul Sanem's video reminded us, the security forces were using. I'm not even sure what kind of weapons. If those horrific wounds were caused by percussion grenades or tear gas or something, it means they were firing them directly at people. There seems to be ample evidence that the security forces exceeded their authority in trying to keep order within the city, but I don't hear anything about them being investigated. That's the part of the investigation you don't get at all. You hear about the people that were detained for protesting, but clearly there are people who were in the law enforcement agencies at the time who also committed some serious crimes out there, lots of them, but I don't, some people got dismissed right after that, but you don't hear about any specific police officers or security force members being taken in for, causing bodily harm unnecessarily.
Maybe one more question that I received about the crackdown. How much do we know about protests and crackdown in other cities of Karakalpakstan? I mean, outside Nukus. Anyone?
I've heard, okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Pasam.
Yeah, I've heard that the number of cities in the north had protests, but the scale was not as big as the one in Nukus. But it was through Karakalpakstan in 5 or 6 major cities of Karakalpakstan.
Bruce, Steve, do you want to add anything on that?
That I heard that there was already protests in at the very end of June in other cities. So this was everything kind of. The Nukus was clearly the biggest of the protests, but there were protests in other cities too. We don't have as much information, probably because we don't have as many people with. We knew that they had already shut down the internet in the days going, and certainly to some of the outlying areas in the days leading up to July 1st. But I did hear that, in fact, people, strangely from Turkmen news agencies, that these protests had already broken out close to the Turkmen border on July 28th, 29th, June 28th, 29th. So.
Thank you. Question maybe more for Steve, but Adam and Bruce are of course more than welcome to answer. What about religious rights, religious freedom in Karakalpakstan? Is it more restrictive or more restricted, or on the contrary, is it a little bit more liberal? What about religious minorities in this region?
It is a good question. And, last year, I was part of a study put out by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom that looked at specifically religious prisoners, mostly from the time of Karimov, but some from the time of Mirziyoyev, and how, while there have been a significant number of people released since 2016 among the religious prisoners, we still have what I estimated to be about 2,000 or more, about 2,000 to 2,200 prisoners in Uzbekistan's prison system now. And again, this ties back into the comment about our lack of data about ethnicity and ethnic breakdown among the prison population. But these are prisoners whose cases should be looked at. They should be examined. Maybe not everyone can be released, but there should be an examination of this, because again, this legacy of using Article 159 with a broad brush, lacking evidence, and putting people away for sometimes 6 to 18 or 20 years is very problematic. Now, what do we know about Karakalpakstan? I can say that having visited the region in 2019 and witnessing firsthand how security forces were dismantling a peaceful protest in front of my eyes, I can say that the heavy hand of the security services is certainly felt. I don't know if we can say that it's more or less than other regions, but one thing is for sure, there's still very much, I think, an outsized influence of the security services in all of these aspects. And in terms of religious minorities, what we've more often, and we have folks from USERF on this call, on this Zoom, which is great. But of course, we've seen various religious minorities not able to fully realize their rights of religious freedom, from the Shia community in Bukhara to others, although there have been many improvements on the rights of Christians in terms of the registration of certain minority faiths, although still a lot of obstacles. But I think in general, despite, and also at the same time, this is coinciding with a strong revival of interest in Islam, and also a troubling alliance between certain religious leaders that aligned with the government and bloggers, I should say, and a sort of, a sort of political, at times bullying of various groups, including LGBT. So it's a very complicated picture, but I would say in terms of these protests, I look much more directly at the cultural, the ethnic, and the political and the linguistic aspects that drove the protests than the religious ones. And I do think that it's absolutely the case, and it was mentioned here in the chat, that we need to look very closely at the legality of the use of force, the violation of the right to life, the types of weapons used. And we do need to be hearing more about accountability. That might have been mentioned in the first days by the president when he was climbing down from these amendments. But by and large, the emphasis ever since then has been, as Bruce just said, on the mercy being and the compassion being shown to the people that have been released from prison to house arrest, and a large emphasis on that, and much less on the human rights violations that took place in the days of those protests and now in the conditions of the detained.
Thank you. And so unfortunately, we'll need to conclude. Let me maybe take a last question, which would be a good concluding question, not necessarily easy to answer, but what, I mean, Steve already mentioned a little bit of that, but what should the government do to strengthen trust between Karakalpakstan populations and political authorities? What would be the most anticipated measures?
You want to start, please?
All right, sure, I'll go first. Well, what I just mentioned too, you gotta, there's people that were employees of the government or in law enforcement that are guilty of some of this stuff too. The first thing they could do to try to show good faith would be to find out who it was that was exceeding their authority and opening fire on unarmed protesters. Because I've never really seen any compelling evidence, certainly prior to the outbreak of violence, that anyone of the protesters had any weapons. And clearly some of these wounds that you see, and again in Paul Sanam's video, were not caused by an AK-47 or a pistol. There's something much more lethal was at work there, and they need to find out who gave the order to fire. So that people can see that it is a true and full investigation, that the people, anyone responsible for violence out there is being held to account on these kind of things. Now, if they had, after following that, it would be a good idea, since we know that elections are probably going to be coming up after they do these amendments, if they had something where true representatives of the peoples of that region were elected, and not government appointees from where Tashkent is the one that's signing off on who these people are, so that the people felt that they had legitimate voice and say. It might not lead to great change, but at least somebody who would speak up for them. And certainly they have a long list of issues that need to be raised, but a truly representative. So
sorry, go ahead. Up to you.
I think it will be really hard to build the trust. Right now, Karakalpak people do not trust Uzbek government at all. And the only way to restart the communication maybe with intervention of international community. And because currently, if Uzbek government will start doing that, people will be very suspicious of every actions. They betrayed them, the government. They violated their basic human rights. So I don't think right now people are able to accept whatever the Uzbek government says, because all the time the history shows again and again that Uzbek government is a liar. They are not trustworthy.
Steve?
Well, I agree with all of these recommendations. I would say, just going off on my list, scrap the June 2022 NGO decree that dramatically restricts and makes it perhaps very impossible for USAID and other funders to actually work with independent groups if this NGO decree goes forward. It also takes away the right of ethnic minority communities to form their own NGOs, which is a part of this process. That's one. I think two, let's listen to international human rights law. We need to consult ethnic minority communities in the design and the implementation and the execution of the 2023 census. I hope we'll have some separate events talking about that. I think ensuring language rights in Karakalpakstan is going to be key. I think allowing independent experts and human rights groups on the ground in Karakalpakstan to engage with these findings. I think for engaging with the findings of the Open Dialogue Foundation, of Vitaly Ponomaryov, and the other groups that put the death toll higher and provide us actual names. And finally, I would say just allowing for a less choreographed, less orchestrated, and very difficult conversation to happen in Uzbekistan about these issues. And, I started with the Meskhetian Turks and the Tajiks, ending with the Karakalpaks. I think those are difficult conversations. We know they're difficult in the United States, by the way, but we need to have them. We need to have a space for that on TV, in Parliament. And yes, the president, I hope, will address these issues in press conferences as well.
Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we really need to conclude now. We're late. I mean, of course, many things are happening in Uzbekistan, but we will continue to follow the situation closely, and we will continue to organize events like this one we had today. So I would like to thank our three presenters, Palsalam, Steve, and Bruce, for their presentation, for the discussion. I would say a special thank you to Palsalam for courage to be with us today and talk. I would also like to thank our audience for being with us today, and so we look forward to having you again in one of our upcoming seminars. So thank you very, very much again. Have a nice day or have a good evening. Bye.